The summer of 1833 arrived in Red River Parish, Louisiana, with the kind of oppressive heat that made the air itself feel like a living thing pressing down on your chest. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under a sun that seemed to burn with a particular cruelty that year, as if the heavens themselves were punishing the earth for sins committed in shadow and silence. The Red River moved sluggishly through the landscape, its waters the color of rust and clay, carrying with it the sediment of 1,000 miles of American soil, depositing layer upon layer of fertility along its banks, while simultaneously washing away the evidence of countless atrocities committed along its shores. Louisiana in 1833 was a place of stark contrasts and darker contradictions. The state had been American for only 3 decades, having been purchased from Napoleon Bonaparte in a transaction that tripled the size of the young nation and extended its slaveholding territory deep into what had been French and Spanish colonial lands. The culture that developed in Louisiana was unique, a mixture of French Creole traditions, Spanish law, African spiritual practices, and American Protestant capitalism that created a society unlike anything else in the South. Ezekiel Morrison owned 300 acres of prime farmland along the Red River, where the soil ran dark and rich with generations of sediment. He was a man of imposing stature, standing well over 6 feet tall, with hands calloused from years of working the land and eyes that carried the cold calculation of someone who saw everything as a commodity to be exploited. His wheat fields were legendary throughout the parish, producing golden harvests that made other farmers whisper with envy during Sunday services at the Baptist church. But Ezekiel was not content with mere admiration. He craved something deeper, something that transcended simple material success. He had come to Louisiana from Virginia in 1820, bringing with him his young bride, Margaret, and a small inheritance that he had invested in land and human chattel. Those early years had been difficult, marked by disease and crop failures, and the constant struggle to establish himself among the established planter class who viewed newcomers with suspicion and disdain. But Ezekiel possessed a particular kind of ruthlessness that served him well in Louisiana's frontier economy, a willingness to do whatever was necessary to succeed, regardless of moral cost or human suffering. But Ezekiel Morrison had a secret that ran deeper than the roots of his wheat, darker than the Mississippi mud, and more terrible than anything the good Christian folk of Red River Parish could imagine in their worst nightmares. It was a secret that would eventually consume him, destroy his family, and leave a stain on that land that time itself seemed unable to wash away. The Morrison farmhouse stood 3 stories tall, a monument to Ezekiel's success, painted white with green shutters that clattered in the wind like skeletal fingers tapping against the windows. It was an ostentatious structure for the frontier, built in the Greek Revival style that was becoming fashionable among the planter class, with tall columns on the front porch and elaborate cornices that spoke of wealth and ambition. Inside, his wife Margaret moved through the rooms like a ghost, her once bright eyes now hollow and distant, her hands trembling whenever she poured tea or folded laundry. Margaret had been beautiful once, or so the daguerreotypes from her wedding day suggested. She had possessed the kind of delicate features that Southern society valued in its women, along with an education unusual for females of her generation. She could read Latin and French, could play the pianoforte with considerable skill, could discuss literature and philosophy with an intelligence that had initially attracted Ezekiel to her. But 13 years of marriage had transformed her from a vivacious young woman into something brittle and broken, her spine bent by the weight of violence and fear, her voice reduced to barely a whisper in her own home. She had learned years ago that silence was survival, that questions led to bruises, and that the screams from the barn were something she had trained herself not to hear. In the beginning, she had tried to intervene, had pleaded with her husband to show mercy to the enslaved people on their property, had even threatened to write to her father back in Virginia about Ezekiel's brutal treatment of his human property. The beating that followed that threat had been so severe that she miscarried the child she had been carrying, her fourth pregnancy in as many years. And Dr. Rousseau had warned her that another such assault might kill her outright. After that, Margaret had retreated into a kind of internal exile, performing her duties as mistress of the household with mechanical efficiency while letting her mind wander to places far from Red River Parish, far from Louisiana, far from the nightmare her life had become. She developed elaborate fantasies of escape, of taking the children and fleeing north to her family in Virginia, but she knew these dreams were impossible. Ezekiel monitored her correspondence, controlled every penny of household money, and had made it clear that any attempt to leave would result in consequences more terrible than she could imagine. Their 3 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, and young Samuel, aged 14, 11, and 8 respectively, had inherited their mother's fearful eyes and their father's strong jawline. They worked the fields alongside the enslaved people their father owned, though they ate at a different table and slept under a different roof. The irony of this arrangement was lost on no one except perhaps Ezekiel himself, who saw no contradiction in preaching about freedom and liberty at town meetings while keeping 23 human beings in chains on his property. It was late June when the first disappearance occurred, though no one in the parish noticed immediately, because the person who vanished was a young enslaved man named Solomon, barely 16 years old, with dreams of escape that he whispered about in the slave quarters after the sun went down. Solomon was different from many of the others on the Morrison plantation. He had been born free in Philadelphia, the son of a freed blacksmith and a seamstress, and had been kidnapped from the streets near his father's shop when he was 12 years old, by slave catchers who falsified papers claiming he was a runaway from Virginia. The 4 years since his abduction had not broken Solomon's spirit. Though they had taught him caution and cunning, he could read and write, skills he kept carefully hidden, because literacy in a slave was seen as dangerous by men like Ezekiel Morrison. At night, by the light of tallow candles salvaged from the main house, Solomon would practice his letters in the dirt floor of the quarters, would write messages to a family he knew he would likely never see again, would keep alive the memory of a life where he had been a person rather than property. Solomon had made the mistake of looking Ezekiel Morrison directly in the eye during a dispute about work quotas, had dared to suggest that the wheat harvest could be completed more efficiently if they were given adequate rest and better tools. The other enslaved workers had frozen when Solomon spoke, knowing that such directness could bring terrible consequences. But Solomon had learned a different kind of courage in Philadelphia, had been raised to believe that he was a human being with rights and dignity, and 4 years of bondage had not entirely erased that fundamental sense of self. Ezekiel had smiled at Solomon's boldness, a thin smile that never reached his eyes, a smile that made the older enslaved workers exchange worried glances because they had seen that smile before and knew what it portended. He told Solomon they would discuss the matter further after supper, told him to meet at the wheat field near the river, where they could talk privately about his concerns. Solomon, who understood the danger but also felt the desperate need to assert his humanity even in this small way, agreed to the meeting. Solomon was never seen alive again. The official story, told to the other enslaved people as a warning, was that Solomon had attempted to escape and had been sold to a plantation down in the bayou country where runaways were worked to death in the cypress swamps. But 3 of the older enslaved men knew better, because they had been forced to help Ezekiel that night, had been made to dig a hole in the wheat field while Solomon screamed through a gag, had watched as their master methodically broke every bone in the boy's body before burying him alive in the rich, dark soil where the wheat grew tallest and most golden. The three men, whose names were Isaiah, Benjamin, and Moses, names given to them by previous owners in mockery of the biblical stories of liberation they would never experience, were chosen for this task precisely because Ezekiel knew they had families on the plantation, children and wives, whose safety depended on their silence and cooperation. As they dug the hole in the moonlit wheat field, their shovels cutting through soil that smelled of minerals and decay, they each made silent calculations about survival and resistance, about which battles could be fought and which had to be endured. Isaiah, the oldest of the three at 42, had been enslaved his entire life, had been sold away from his mother when he was 8 years old, had watched 3 of his own children sold to different plantations when their master needed cash to pay gambling debts. He had learned to survive by making himself invisible, by anticipating his owner's needs before they were spoken, by cultivating a mask of docility that hid the rage that burned in his chest like an eternal flame. As he dug Solomon's grave, Isaiah thought about that rage, about how it had sustained him through decades of bondage, about how it would need to sustain him through whatever came next. Benjamin was 35, and had been purchased by Ezekiel Morrison 5 years earlier at an estate sale in Natchez. He had been a skilled carpenter in his previous life, had built furniture of such quality that his former master had hired him out to wealthy clients throughout Mississippi, always keeping Benjamin's wages for himself, but allowing the enslaved man to feel a certain pride in his craftsmanship. On the Morrison plantation, Benjamin's skills were wasted on rough field work. His hands that could carve intricate designs in hardwood now blistered and bleeding from cotton picking and wheat harvesting. As he helped lower Solomon's broken body into the hole they had dug, Benjamin felt something inside himself crack and break, some last hope that there might be justice or mercy in the world. Moses was the youngest of the three, only 25 years old, married to a woman named Sarah, who was pregnant with their second child. He had been born on a plantation in South Carolina and had been sold to a trader after his first owner died, had walked in chains from Charleston to New Orleans, had stood on an auction block while men examined his teeth and muscles like he was livestock. Ezekiel Morrison had purchased him for his youth and strength, had worked him 16 hours a day in the fields, had whipped him for perceived slowness or disobedience. As Moses helped shovel dirt over Solomon's still living body, listening to the muffled screams that gradually faded into silence, he made a promise to himself that he would find a way to tell this story, that Solomon's death would not be forgotten, that somehow, someday, there would be an accounting for what happened in this wheat field. The men were told that if they ever spoke of what they witnessed, their own families would join Solomon in the earth. Ezekiel made this threat while cleaning his hands on a cloth, his voice calm and conversational, as if he were discussing crop rotation or weather patterns rather than murder. He explained to them, in the patient tone a teacher might use with slow students, that the land demanded sacrifice, that fertility required blood, that the magnificent harvests produced by his wheat fields came at a price that someone had to pay. He told them that Solomon had been necessary, that his death had meaning in the larger scheme of things, that they should feel honored to have participated in something so important. The three men listened in silence, their faces carefully blank, their bodies held in positions of submission and deference that had been beaten into them over years of bondage. But inside each of them, something had shifted, some calculation had been made, some line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. They did not speak of resistance or revenge, knew better than to give voice to such thoughts, even in the privacy of the slave quarters. But they watched Ezekiel Morrison with new eyes after that night, and they waited. As the summer progressed, Ezekiel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spent long hours walking through his wheat fields, running his hands through the grain with an expression that his wife could only describe as rapturous. He began to talk about the land as if it were alive, as if it could hear him and respond to his whispers. At dinner, he would speak of how the wheat had never grown so tall, how the kernels had never been so full and heavy, how this harvest would be the greatest Red River parish had ever seen. Margaret noticed that her husband had begun to smell different, a sour odor that reminded her of turned earth and decay, no matter how often he bathed. She noticed that he had started to grind his teeth in his sleep, making a sound like millstones crushing grain. Most disturbing of all, she noticed that he had begun to look at their children with an expression she couldn't quite name, but that made her blood run cold. The children themselves had become withdrawn and fearful. Thomas, the eldest, had stopped speaking at meals unless directly addressed. Elizabeth had developed a nervous habit of pulling at her hair until small, bald patches appeared on her scalp. Young Samuel had begun to wet the bed again, something he hadn't done since he was 4 years old. When Margaret tried to comfort them, to ask what was wrong, they would only shake their heads and stare at the floor as if the very act of looking up might invite some terrible punishment. It was on a sweltering night in early August, when the heat was so intense that even the cicadas seemed to have given up their singing, that Margaret Morrison woke to find her husband's side of the bed empty. She lay there for a long moment, listening to the house settle and creak around her, trying to convince herself to simply roll over and go back to sleep. But something, some instinct she couldn't name, drove her to rise and search for him. She found Ezekiel in the children's room, standing over Samuel's bed with a pillow in his hands, his face twisted into an expression of such concentrated malice that Margaret felt her heart stop in her chest. She screamed, a sound that tore from her throat like something animal and primal, and Ezekiel turned to look at her with eyes that seemed to reflect no light at all, eyes that looked like holes punched through to some darker world. The confrontation that followed was violent and terrible. Ezekiel attacked his wife with the same methodical brutality he had shown Solomon, his fists landing with the precision of a man who had practiced violence until it became an art form. The children woke and screamed, but their screams only seemed to fuel their father's rage. By the time he finished, Margaret lay unconscious on the floor, her face so swollen and damaged that she would never look quite the same again. Ezekiel stood over his family, breathing heavily, his hands still clenched into fists. Then he did something that would haunt the memories of his children for the rest of their lives. He smiled, reached down, and gently stroked Margaret's ruined face with surprising tenderness. He told the children to go back to sleep, that their mother had simply fallen down the stairs, that everything would be fine in the morning. His voice was calm, almost soothing, which made the moment infinitely more terrifying than if he had continued to rage. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Samuel climbed back into their beds and pulled the covers up to their chins, their eyes wide and unblinking in the darkness, listening to their father's footsteps as he walked back to the master bedroom, listening to their mother's labored breathing as she lay on the floor where he had left her. The next morning, the parish doctor was summoned, a man named Albert Rousseau, who had been tending to the families of Red River Parish for nearly 30 years. He examined Margaret with practiced efficiency, noting the pattern of bruises that could only come from repeated blows, the defensive wounds on her forearms, the way she flinched when anyone moved too quickly near her. Dr. Rousseau had seen domestic violence before, had treated wives and children who bore the marks of patriarchal rage. But something about the Morrison household made his skin crawl in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He pulled Ezekiel aside and suggested, in the careful diplomatic language that doctors used when speaking to dangerous men, that perhaps Margaret needed rest, that perhaps the heat and stress of the harvest season had affected everyone's temperament, that perhaps some time apart might be beneficial for the entire family. Ezekiel listened with apparent patience, nodding at appropriate moments, but Dr. Rousseau could see something flickering behind the farmer's eyes, something that made him think of rabid dogs and trapped animals. When the doctor left the Morrison farm that afternoon, he made a mental note to speak with the parish sheriff, though he knew from experience that the law rarely intervened in family matters, especially when the family in question owned as much land and influence as the Morrisons did. Margaret Morrison recovered slowly from her physical injuries, but something fundamental had broken inside her that night. She moved through the house like a woman underwater, her movements slow and dreamlike, her eyes focused on something no one else could see. She stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through nods and head shakes, her silence more eloquent than any words could be. The children adapted as children do, learning to read the subtle signs of their father's moods, learning to become invisible when his eyes took on that particular glassy quality, learning to eat quickly and quietly at meals so they could escape back to their rooms before the inevitable explosion of temper occurred. They developed a code of looks and gestures, a silent language that allowed them to warn each other when danger was approaching, a survival mechanism that would serve them well in the nightmare that was still to come. As August gave way to September, the wheat crop reached its peak, standing tall and golden across Ezekiel's 300 acres. The harvest was scheduled to begin on the first Monday of the month, and enslaved workers from neighboring plantations had been contracted to help bring in the crop, a common practice during peak harvest season, when every pair of hands was needed to gather the wheat before weather or pests could damage the yield. But on the Sunday before harvest was set to begin, Ezekiel Morrison gathered his family for what he called a special dinner. He had prepared the meal himself, sending the enslaved woman who usually cooked for the family back to the quarters, insisting that this was to be an intimate family occasion. He served roasted chicken with potatoes and greens, poured wine for Margaret, though she rarely drank, carved the meat with ceremonial precision, while the children watched with growing unease. As they ate, Ezekiel began to talk about the farm, about legacy and inheritance, about the importance of the land and how it demanded sacrifice from those who would work it. He spoke of ancient agricultural practices, of civilizations that had buried offerings in their fields to ensure bountiful harvests, of the way blood and bone enriched the soil in ways that no amount of manure or crop rotation could match. Thomas, who at 14 was old enough to understand the implications of his father's words, felt his throat constrict around the food he was trying to swallow. Elizabeth had stopped eating entirely, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Young Samuel, who didn't fully grasp what his father was saying but could sense the wrongness in his tone, began to cry silently, tears streaming down his face while he tried desperately not to make any sound that might draw attention to himself. Margaret sat at the opposite end of the table, her wine untouched, her eyes fixed on her husband with an expression that might have been recognition or resignation or some terrible combination of both. She had known, on some level she had always known, that this moment was coming, that her husband's madness would eventually turn toward their own flesh and blood. When Ezekiel finished his monologue, he stood and walked around the table, placing his hands on each child's shoulder in turn, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. He told them he loved them, that everything he had done and everything he was about to do was for the farm, for the legacy, for the future. Then he told them to finish their dinner and go to bed early, that tomorrow would be a very important day. That night, Thomas Morrison made a decision that would save his life, but haunt him forever. He quietly woke his siblings, placed his hand over Samuel's mouth to prevent the boy from crying out, and led them through the darkened house toward the back door that opened onto the fields. He had overheard enough of his father's increasingly deranged speeches about sacrifice and blood offerings to understand that they were in mortal danger, that the man who called himself their father had long ago surrendered whatever humanity he might have once possessed. They ran through the wheat fields, the stalks whispering around them in the night wind, their bare feet silent on the earth that had been enriched by Solomon's remains, and God only knew how many others. Thomas had a plan, formed from scraps of overheard conversation and desperate hope. There was a family 20 miles downriver, abolitionists who were rumored to help escaped slaves make their way north through the Underground Railroad. If the children could reach them before their father discovered they were gone, they might have a chance at survival. But they had underestimated Ezekiel Morrison's vigilance and his intimate knowledge of his own property. He had anticipated the possibility of flight, had placed bells on the back gate that would alert him to any attempt at escape. The children were barely a quarter-mile from the house when they heard his voice calling out behind them, calm and patient, as if he were simply summoning them for supper rather than hunting them through the darkness with murder in his heart. What followed was a chase that seemed to last hours, but probably only took minutes. A desperate flight through wheat that grabbed at their clothing and skin, through irrigation ditches that twisted their ankles, through areas of the property they had never explored and now wished they never would. Ezekiel herded them like livestock, using his knowledge of the land to cut off escape routes, to funnel them toward a predetermined destination, to tire them until they could run no more. They ended up in the oldest section of the wheat field, where the grain grew tallest and the soil was darkest, where the earth seemed to pulse with some terrible vitality. Ezekiel stood before them, barely winded, his face expressionless in the moonlight. He carried a shovel in one hand and a length of rope in the other, and when he spoke his voice was almost gentle, almost loving. He explained that the farm demanded sacrifice, that the land required blood and bone to continue producing its magnificent harvests, that he had been chosen by forces older than Christianity and deeper than any law made by men to be the instrument of that sacrifice. He said that he had resisted at first, had tried to satisfy the land's hunger with the lives of those he considered less valuable, but that the wheat had whispered to him that it wanted his own blood, his own children, that only the most precious sacrifice would ensure the farm's continued prosperity. Thomas, Elizabeth, and Samuel Morrison stood frozen with terror, their minds unable to fully process what their father was saying, unable to accept that the man who had taught them to ride horses and helped them with their arithmetic homework was now calmly explaining why he needed to murder them and bury their bodies in his wheat field. It was Margaret who saved them, Margaret who had followed her husband into the night, who had armed herself with one of the rifles kept in the house for protection against wolves and wild boar, who had somehow found the strength to do what needed to be done, despite months of abuse and conditioning to submit and stay silent. The shot rang out across the dark fields, scattering birds from the trees and sending small animals fleeing through the underbrush. Ezekiel Morrison staggered forward, a look of surprise on his face, his hand reaching back to touch the wound in his shoulder where Margaret's bullet had struck him. He turned slowly to face his wife, and in that moment, something seemed to break in him, some final thread that had been holding his madness in check. He charged at her with a roar that sounded barely human, and Margaret shot him again, this time in the chest. He fell to his knees, but continued crawling toward her, his fingers clawing at the earth, his mouth working soundlessly as blood filled his lungs. She shot him a third time, and a fourth, and a fifth, continuing to pull the trigger even after the rifle was empty. Even after Ezekiel Morrison lay still in the wheat field he had so lovingly cultivated. The children ran to their mother and clung to her as she collapsed, the rifle falling from her hands, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. They stayed like that until dawn broke over Red River Parish, a family shattered beyond any hope of repair, their arms wrapped around each other as the wheat whispered around them in the morning breeze. The authorities were summoned, of course, and an investigation was conducted. The sheriff and his deputies found Solomon's remains buried in the wheat field, along with the bodies of 2 other enslaved people who had disappeared over the past year, people whose absence had been explained away with stories of sales to distant plantations, or fatal accidents, or successful escapes. They found Ezekiel's journals, page after page of increasingly incoherent ramblings about blood sacrifices and speaking wheat and the demands of the land. Margaret Morrison was never charged with any crime. The parish judge, after reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from Dr. Rousseau and several neighbors who described Ezekiel's increasingly erratic behavior, ruled the shooting a clear case of self-defense and defense of her children. The enslaved people on the Morrison farm were freed immediately, sold to themselves for $1 each by Margaret Morrison in a private ceremony that the parish did its best to keep quiet, though word spread through the enslaved communities along the Red River like wildfire, a story of liberation born from tragedy. The Morrison farmhouse stood empty after that night. Margaret took her children and moved to New Orleans, where they lived with her sister's family and tried to build new lives from the wreckage of the old. Thomas eventually became a lawyer who specialized in defending the rights of freed people during Reconstruction. Elizabeth joined a convent and spent her life in silent contemplation and prayer. Samuel drank himself to death before his 30th birthday, unable to escape the nightmares that plagued him every time he closed his eyes. Margaret herself lived to be 70 years old, but she never spoke another word after the night she killed her husband. She communicated through writing and gestures, and those who knew her said that sometimes, on quiet nights, they could see her lips moving as if in prayer or perhaps in conversation with someone no one else could see. The Morrison farm was eventually sold at auction, the proceeds used to establish a fund for the education of freed slaves and their children, a small act of restitution that could never truly balance the scales of justice, but at least acknowledge the debt that was owed. The wheat fields were left fallow for several years, and when new owners finally tried to plant crops there, the yields were poor and stunted, as if the land itself had been poisoned by what had occurred on its surface. Neighbors reported strange occurrences on the property over the years that followed, the sound of children crying in the wheat fields when the fields were empty, the smell of freshly turned earth on nights when no one had been working the soil, shadows moving between the stalks when the sun was at its highest point. The Morrison farmhouse, despite being structurally sound, never stayed occupied for more than a few months at a time, with tenants leaving abruptly and refusing to discuss their reasons for departing. By the 1850s, the property had been abandoned entirely, left to return to the wild state from which Ezekiel Morrison had once coaxed such abundant harvests. The wheat went to seed and spread, growing in wild, chaotic patterns across the 300 acres, mixing with native grasses and wildflowers until it was impossible to tell where the cultivated fields had ended and the natural landscape had begun. During the Civil War, Confederate troops passing through Red River Parish gave the Morrison property a wide berth, claiming they heard voices calling to them from the fields. Voices that promised rest and relief from the exhaustion of war if they would only lie down in the wheat and sleep. Union forces who occupied the area in the latter years of the conflict reported similar experiences, and several soldiers went missing in the vicinity of the old farm, their bodies never recovered despite extensive searches. Local people, both white and black, developed elaborate rituals to avoid the Morrison land. They would cross themselves when passing the property line, would refuse to let their livestock graze near the old wheat fields, would warn their children away from the area with stories that grew more elaborate and horrifying with each retelling. The truth of what had occurred there became mixed with legend and superstition until it was impossible to separate fact from folklore. But there were three men who knew the truth. Three men who had been forced to help Ezekiel Morrison bury Solomon in the wheat field all those years ago. Three men who had carried that secret through the war and into the uncertain freedom that followed. They were old men by the time Reconstruction ended, and the promise of genuine liberty faded into the grim reality of sharecropping and segregation. Old men who gathered on porches in the evening to smoke pipes and remember. They talked about Ezekiel Morrison and what he had done, about the madness that could infect a man who believed he owned not just land, but the people who worked it, who believed that his property rights extended to the very lives and deaths of those under his control. They talked about how that madness was not unique to Morrison, how it was woven into the fabric of a society that had built its prosperity on the backs of enslaved people, how it would continue to poison the land long after the chains had been struck off and the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed. One of the three men, whose name was Isaiah, and who had been freed from the Morrison farm on that terrible night in 1833, lived to see the dawn of the 20th century. He died in 1903 at the age of 86, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them born free, all of them carrying within them the story of the Morrison farm and the price that had been paid for their liberty. On his deathbed, Isaiah told his eldest grandson about that night in the wheat field, about watching Solomon die screaming beneath the earth, about the feel of the soil in his hands as he helped cover the boy's grave, about the sound of Ezekiel Morrison's laughter as he stood over the freshly turned earth and proclaimed that the next harvest would be the finest the parish had ever seen. But Isaiah also told his grandson about Margaret Morrison, about the way she had stood in the moonlight with a rifle in her hands and made the choice to save her children rather than submit to her husband's madness. He told him about the 3 shots that rang out across the dark fields, about the way Ezekiel had fallen into the wheat he had so lovingly cultivated, about how the land itself seemed to sigh with relief when his blood finally soaked into the soil. The lesson, Isaiah said, was not that freedom came without cost, but that the cost of remaining enslaved, whether by literal chains or by fear or by the weight of tradition and expectation, was always higher. He said that Margaret Morrison had understood something fundamental that night, something that every person who had ever been held in bondage understood in their bones, that there comes a moment when you must choose between survival and submission, when you must decide whether to remain silent and complicit or to speak and act, even if the consequences are terrible. The Morrison farm stands empty still, a monument to the violence that built America and the courage required to tear down the systems that sustained that violence. The wheat grows wild there now, golden and beautiful in the late summer sun, swaying in the breeze like waves on an endless ocean. Birds nest in the abandoned farmhouse, and deer browse in what were once carefully cultivated fields. Nature has reclaimed what Ezekiel Morrison once claimed to own, has erased most traces of his presence from the land. But on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the wheat in just the right way, people say you can still hear things in those fields. The sound of children running, of feet pounding on packed earth, of frightened breathing and whispered prayers. The sound of a shovel breaking ground, of dirt being moved and replaced. The sound of a woman's voice, strong and clear despite years of silence, saying a single word that echoes across the generations. Enough. The Morrison farm is a reminder that freedom is never granted willingly by those who hold power, that it must be seized and defended, that its price is often paid in blood and trauma and generations of grief. It is a reminder that the madness of believing you can own another human being corrupts not just the enslaved, but the enslaver, that it poisons the land and the soul, that it creates wounds that time alone cannot heal. The wheat still grows in Red River Parish. In fields worked now by free people who negotiate their wages and choose their employers, who send their children to schools and worship in churches of their own choosing, who vote and marry and accumulate property and exercise all the rights that were denied to their ancestors. But the memory of places like the Morrison farm persists. A ghost story and a history lesson and a warning all rolled into one. Some stories are too important to forget, too terrible to ignore, too real to dismiss as mere folklore. The story of Ezekiel Morrison and the wheat field where he buried Solomon and planned to bury his own children is one of those stories. It speaks to the capacity for evil that exists in hearts that have learned to see other people as property, to the courage required to resist, even when resistance seems impossible, to the long and painful process of building a society that recognizes the fundamental humanity and dignity of every person, regardless of the color of their skin or their position in the social hierarchy. The land remembers, the wheat whispers, and those who listen carefully might hear not just the rustle of grain in the wind, but the voices of all those who suffered and died on soil that was bought with their labor and enriched with their blood, voices calling out for justice and remembrance and the kind of freedom that cannot be bought or sold or buried beneath any amount of golden grain. Thomas Morrison, in his later years as a lawyer fighting for the rights of freed people, would sometimes wake in the night from dreams of running through wheat fields with his father's voice calling behind him. He would rise and walk to his window and look out at the New Orleans streets, at the mixture of races and cultures that made that city unique in the American South, at the slow and painful progress toward a more perfect union. He thought about his mother, about the courage it had taken for her to pull that trigger, about the years of abuse she had endured before finally reaching the breaking point. He thought about his father, about the madness that had consumed a man who might once have been merely cruel and ordinary into something monstrous and unforgivable. And he thought about Solomon, a boy he had barely known, whose death had set in motion a chain of events that had destroyed one family while inadvertently freeing 23 others. Freedom, Thomas understood, was never simple, never clean, never achieved without sacrifice. It was messy and violent and incomplete, bought with the lives of those who refused to accept their chains, defended by those who understood that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of complicity. His mother had been silent for years, beaten into submission by a man who believed his ownership of land extended to ownership of the people on that land, including his own wife and children. But when silence became impossible, when submission meant the deaths of her children, Margaret Morrison had found her voice in the thunder of gunfire, had written her Declaration of Independence in her husband's blood. It was not a story anyone wanted to tell or hear, not a narrative that fit comfortably into the myths America told itself about the noble South or the righteous North, about the gradual progress toward justice or the inevitable triumph of good over evil. It was simply the truth, raw and ugly and undeniable, about what freedom cost and who paid the price, and why the wheat fields of Red River Parish would forever carry the weight of what had been done there in the name of prosperity and property and the right to own other human beings. Elizabeth Morrison, in her convent cell, prayed for her father's soul despite everything he had done, prayed for the souls of all those who had died in his wheat fields, prayed for a world where such madness could not take root and flourish. Her prayers were not simple or comfortable, not the rote recitations of catechism, but deep interrogations of a God who had allowed such suffering to exist, who had permitted good people to be ground down by evil, who seemed sometimes to sleep while injustice reigned. She found no easy answers in her prayers, but she found something like peace in the act of asking the questions, in the discipline of bearing witness to the darkness without letting it consume her entirely. She wrote letters to her brother and to the descendants of those who had been enslaved on their father's farm. Letters that tried to articulate something about forgiveness and justice and the long road toward reconciliation that America would need to travel if it hoped to ever live up to its stated ideals. Samuel Morrison, who could not find peace in law or prayer, who drowned his memories in alcohol until his liver failed and his body gave out, perhaps understood the truth most clearly of all, that some wounds never heal, that some trauma cannot be overcome through willpower or faith or the passage of time. He had been 8 years old when his father tried to kill him, 8 years old when he watched his mother shoot his father dead, 8 years old when the world revealed itself to be a place where parents could become monsters, and safety was an illusion, and the wheat whispered secrets that no child should ever hear. He died raving about wheat fields and buried children, about soil that demanded blood and fathers who sharpened shovels in the moonlight. His siblings buried him in New Orleans, far from Red River Parish, far from the Morrison farm, far from the wheat that still grew wild and golden across 300 cursed acres. But they knew that in some fundamental way, Samuel had never left that farm, had never escaped from that night when he learned that love could be as dangerous as hate, that family could be as oppressive as chains, that freedom sometimes required the destruction of everything you thought you knew about the world. The story of the Morrison farm spread through Louisiana and beyond, carried by former enslaved people who had been freed that night, by abolitionists who seized on it as proof of slavery's corrupting influence, by journalists and historians who saw in it a microcosm of the larger tragedy that was American slavery. Some versions emphasized Ezekiel's madness, making him an aberration rather than a symptom of a sick society. Other versions emphasized Margaret's courage, turning her into a hero of the abolitionist cause. But the people who had lived through it, who had felt the weight of Ezekiel Morrison's hand on their shoulders and heard the madness in his voice as he talked about blood sacrifices and speaking wheat, they knew that the truth was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture. They knew that Ezekiel had not been uniquely evil, that the system of slavery had produced thousands like him, men who had been given absolute power over other human beings, and who had been corrupted by that power until they could no longer distinguish between property and people, between ownership and love. They knew that Margaret had not been uniquely heroic, that she had endured years of abuse before finally acting, that her courage had been born from desperation rather than conviction, that she had remained silent while Solomon and others died, because speaking up would have meant her own destruction. They knew that the freedom won that night had come at a terrible cost, that the Morrison children would carry scars for the rest of their lives, that the 23 people freed from slavery on that farm would face a world that was in many ways just as hostile and dangerous as the one they had left behind. The wheat continued to grow, season after season, year after year, spreading its seeds across Red River Parish until it became impossible to tell which fields had once been part of the Morrison property and which had not. Farmers would occasionally find things in the soil, fragments of bone or rusted chains, artifacts of a history that the land could not fully forget, even as nature reclaimed what human ambition had temporarily conquered. Children playing in abandoned fields would sometimes stumble across the remains of the Morrison farmhouse, would dare each other to venture inside the rotting structure, would tell ghost stories that mixed fact and fiction until the truth became just another layer in the palimpsest of American folklore. Parents would warn them away, would tell them the land was cursed, would unconsciously perpetuate the myth that evil resided in places rather than in people, that you could avoid moral contamination by simply staying away from where terrible things had happened. But the real lesson of the Morrison farm was not about haunted wheat fields or speaking earth or the supernatural consequences of sin. The real lesson was about power and its abuse, about the casual dehumanization that allowed people to enslave others without apparent moral qualm, about the way systems of oppression corrupt everyone they touch, enslaved and enslaver alike. It was about the courage required to resist such systems, about the price of that resistance, about the long and difficult work of building a society that recognized the fundamental humanity of all people. Isaiah's grandson, who heard the story of that night in the wheat field as his grandfather lay dying, passed it down to his own children and grandchildren, ensuring that the memory of what had happened on the Morrison farm would not be lost or sanitized or forgotten. He told them about Ezekiel Morrison's madness, yes, but he also told them about the system that had created that madness, about the auction blocks and breeding farms and midnight whippings that were the foundation of Southern prosperity, about the way seemingly good Christian people could participate in unspeakable evil, because the law and custom and economic incentive all aligned to make slavery seem natural and necessary and right. He told them about Margaret Morrison too, about her silence and her complicity and her final act of resistance. He did not make her into a simple hero, because the story did not allow for simple heroes, because she had been both victim and bystander, because she had found her courage too late to save Solomon, but just in time to save her children. He told them that courage was complicated, that resistance was messy, that the people who fought against injustice were themselves flawed and frightened and human. And he told them that the fight for freedom was never over, that each generation would face its own Ezekiel Morrisons, its own systems of oppression dressed up in the language of law and tradition and economic necessity. He told them that the wheat fields of Red River Parish still whispered their secrets to anyone willing to listen, that the land remembered even when people tried to forget, that the price of liberty was eternal vigilance and the willingness to act when action was required. The Morrison farm stands empty now, has stood empty for more than a century and a half, a memorial to the cost of freedom and the price of silence. The wheat grows golden in the summer sun, beautiful and terrible, a reminder that evil can cloak itself in beauty, that prosperity can be built on blood and bone, that the land itself can be made complicit in human cruelty. But it is also a reminder that resistance is possible, that people can break their chains, both literal and metaphorical, that there comes a moment in every struggle for justice when someone must stand up and say enough, must take whatever action is necessary to stop the machinery of oppression, must be willing to pay whatever price freedom demands. Margaret Morrison paid that price when she killed her husband in a wheat field in 1833, when she chose her children's lives over her own safety, when she broke years of silence and submission with the thunder of gunfire. The 23 people freed from slavery on the Morrison farm that night paid that price with years of trauma and dislocation, with the loss of the only home they had known, however horrible that home had been, with the challenge of building new lives in a society that did not want them free. Solomon paid the ultimate price, buried alive in a wheat field at 16 years old, his dreams of freedom crushed along with his bones, his life reduced to a cautionary tale told to keep other enslaved people from daring to imagine a different world. But his death was not meaningless, because it set in motion the events that led to the liberation of 23 people, because his story became part of the larger story of resistance and survival, because the wheat that grew from soil enriched by his remains whispered his name to anyone who would listen. The American South is full of places like the Morrison farm, places where terrible things happened in service of an economic system built on human bondage, places where the bones of the enslaved still rest in unmarked graves, places where the land remembers even when the people try to forget. They are not haunted by supernatural forces, but by the weight of history, by the accumulated trauma of generations, by the knowledge that the prosperity enjoyed by some was bought with the suffering of others. These places ask questions that America has never fully answered. How do you reckon with a past built on injustice? How do you move forward when the foundation itself is cracked? How do you create a just society from the ruins of one that was fundamentally unjust? The wheat fields of Red River Parish do not provide answers, but they insist that the questions be asked, that the history be remembered, that the cost of freedom be acknowledged and honored. Thomas Morrison spent his career as a lawyer trying to answer those questions in practical terms, fighting for the rights of freed people to own property and vote and receive equal protection under the law. Elizabeth Morrison tried to answer them through prayer and contemplation, seeking some understanding of a God who had permitted such suffering while also making resistance possible. Samuel Morrison never found any answers at all, drowning his questions in alcohol until they killed him. But all three of them, in their different ways, bore witness to what had happened on the Morrison farm, ensured that the story would not be forgotten, that Solomon and the others buried in those wheat fields would not become anonymous victims, but remembered human beings whose deaths meant something, whose struggles contributed to the larger arc of the moral universe that slowly, painfully, bent toward justice. The wheat still grows in Red River Parish, in fields worked now by people who negotiate their own terms, who cannot be bought or sold or buried alive for daring to look their employers in the eye. It grows golden and beautiful in the late summer sun, and when the wind moves through it, it makes a sound like whispered conversations, like prayers, like promises made and sometimes kept. Those who listen carefully might hear the voices of all those who suffered and died on that land. But they might also hear the voices of all those who survived, who resisted, who refused to accept their chains even when resistance seemed impossible, who kept the dream of freedom alive through generations of oppression until that dream finally, partially, imperfectly came true. The story of Ezekiel Morrison and his wheat field is not a ghost story, not really, though it has been told that way often enough. It is a story about power and its corruption, about the cost of freedom and who pays it, about the long and difficult work of building a just society from the ruins of one that was built on injustice. It is a story that America still needs to hear, still needs to grapple with, still needs to learn from if it hopes to ever fully live up to its stated ideals of liberty and justice for all. The wheat remembers, the land remembers, and those who walk through the fields where the Morrison farm once stood, who feel the soil beneath their feet and hear the wind moving through the grain, would do well to remember too, to carry that history forward, to ensure that the lessons learned in blood and trauma are not forgotten, that the price paid by Solomon and Margaret Morrison and all the others touched by that terrible night in 1833 was not paid in vain. Freedom is never free. Justice is never easy. The wheat knows this, whispers it to anyone who will listen, carries the truth in every golden kernel that grows from soil enriched by the struggles of those who came before. The Morrison farm stands as a monument to that truth, empty and overgrown, haunted not by ghosts, but by memory, by history, by the knowledge that the fight for human dignity and liberty is never over, that each generation must take up the struggle anew. That silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of complicity. The harvest that haunts Louisiana is not wheat, but memory, not grain, but truth, not crops, but the accumulated weight of all the stories that have been buried and forgotten and denied. The Morrison farm demands that those stories be told, that the history be faced honestly, that the cost of freedom be acknowledged and the price of silence be recognized. And so the wheat grows, season after season, year after year, century after century, golden and beautiful and terrible, whispering its secrets to the wind, reminding us that the land remembers even when people try to forget, that the past is never truly past. That the struggle for justice and human dignity is the work of every generation, paid for in blood and courage and the willingness to say, finally, enough.